This video is about Lindbergh's science and faith. You can see on the map there that the trip that he took was from New York to Paris, near Paris. And that's more or less the path. It may seem like a silly path for some people, but if you know your math and geometry and so on, that's actually following the path of the Great Circle. A Great Circle is a circle of the Earth that goes through the center of the Earth. And that's actually, it's because it's on a two-dimensional surface trying to represent 3 dimensions in 2 dimensions. So there's a bit of a warp. But that's actually the direct route, more or less, that was flown. So Charles Lindbergh, that's a picture of him there, with the Spirit of St. Louis. While camping at Promised Land State Park, I finished reading Charles A. Lindbergh's book, We. I try here to answer 2 questions. The first is, was Lindbergh a scientist? The answer is yes, for 2 reasons. Lindbergh was an aeronautical engineer. Engineering overlaps with science. And he also, later in life, was involved with biomechanics. His perfusion pump allowed organs to function outside the body. It was a precursor to the heart-lung machine. Indirectly, therefore, I can thank Lindbergh for helping to extend my mother's life on Earth, as she at one point during surgery was on a heart-lung machine. The second question was, Lindbergh a Christian? That's more challenging. He did believe in evolution. He wrote, quote, "The construction of an airplane is simple when compared to the evolutionary achievement of a bird. If I had to choose, I would rather have birds than airplanes." That's Reader's Digest, 1964. Nevertheless, he was a theistic evolutionist, believing God was behind it all. Quoting from a later issue of Reader's Digest, "God made life simple. It is man who complicates it." Now there's what the book, similar to the book that I read, looked like. We, it's an unusual title. It's really sort of talking about Lindbergh and his airplane, I think, but it could have a broader perspective. Many people participated in making airplanes and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, let's move on. The Smithsonian Article, quote, "To save his dying sister-in-law, Charles Lindbergh invented a medical device." That's 2015. It provided information about the perfusion pump, also referred to his supposed dark past, the article from the Smithsonian did. But all humans on Earth during Lindbergh's time and since are sinners, including biographers who want to discuss the darker side of others. I'm not saying that there's no darker side of Lindbergh, but I'm not going to major on that here. I have decided to stay with the book I read. And there's not too much that's dark side there. I'm not saying that there would be nothing, but I'm not majoring on that. Is there anything in it, that book, to suggest that Lindbergh might have been a Christian? On page 227, this is what Lindbergh wrote. He's on the left there. "But as grateful as I was at the time, it did not take me long to realize that a kind of Providence had placed me in Ambassador Herrick's hands." End of quote. And he capitalized Providence. I emboldened it. I don't think it was emboldened in the book, but he did capitalize. And Providence is a euphemism for God. Washington would speak about Providence, but he's really talking about God. And it's maybe because he doesn't want to profane God's name, use it frivolously, so he uses the term providence indirectly. And in Lindbergh's case, in his words, it was a kind providence. Later we read Ambassador Herrick then made one of the finest and most widely quoted speeches, quote, I am not, Herrick is the man on the right there. I am not a religious man, he said, but I believe there are certain things that happen in life which can only be described as the interpretation of a divine act. So there, Herrick is actually referring to the divine. The very man who had Lindbergh in his hands and who was affirmed by him, there he was referring to the divine. Now I realize that doesn't mean that he was a Christian, but at least it's sort of getting warm. Now, Fitzgerald Green, I think I've got that name right, on page 253 wrote, quote, cutting off his motor, referring to Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh, after his trip across the Atlantic, he, Lindbergh, flew low over the field, but little above the rows of white crosses. He dropped a wreath of flowers, circled the cemetery twice, then headed out for England. Lindbergh, a quiet man, may have been showing quiet respect for the rows of white crosses. He was honoring those who died in war, to be sure, but did the thought of a cross 19 centuries before come to mind? I don't know. I don't rule it out. On page 294 we read, he, Lindbergh, went to church with President and Mrs. Coolidge. And there's a picture of President Coolidge coming down church steps with his wife. I didn't get one of Lindbergh there, but I did get another from a different building. I don't think it was a church building. And Lindbergh there is with President Coolidge, and maybe his wife was there too, I don't know. And there's Coolidge to the left at the lower. Lindbergh went to church with President and Mrs. Coolidge. On page 304 we read, Chief Magistrate of New York City, Mayor Walker, described Lindbergh as, quote, the world's greatest hero. This is sad. The world's greatest hero is none other than the one who conquered sin, death, and the devil on that old rugged cross, coming alive again from a tomb 3 days later. Did Lindbergh believe the mayor? I hope not, but I don't know. The Lord knew or knows Lindbergh's heart. He certainly was a man of courage and adventure, and the world at the time fell in love with him. On page 311 we read, at Hotel Commodore, Mr. Hughes, I'm not too sure who he was, but maybe connected with the hotel somehow. Mr. Hughes referred to Lindbergh's accomplishment with these words, then indeed is the day that hath no equal. Then is the most marvelous day that this old earth has ever known. But crossing the Atlantic cannot be compared with the Lord's crossing from heaven to earth 20 centuries ago. And the most marvelous day happened on resurrection morning when the Father raised his Son, the Creator, from a borrowed tomb. If Lindbergh was a Christian, then Christ's atoning work was for him. This is the last slide. Many people today hardly know Lindbergh. And sadly, many students in America increasingly know little about either the Bible or the central person in it. Few, if any, would be surrounded by millions of praising humans like Lindbergh was. The only way not to face anonymity is to align by faith with the same one who ascended into the clouds without a machine and will return in like manner. See Acts 1:11. in the spirit of Saint Jesus. Saint means Holy One, and Jesus is the Holy One. Talk to Saint Holy Jesus now, asking him for his blood washing and his righteous garment of salvation.